My mother yelled in court that I was unfit, until the judge asked one question. Can you imagine sitting across from your own mother as she screams that you're mentally incompetent in a courtroom full of strangers? Because that's exactly what happened to me. I just sat there, silent, watching her perform. But what she didn't realize was that my silence wasn't weakness. It was my superpower. And the judge? She was about to ask one question that would not only shatter my mother's carefully constructed lie, but expose a decade of chilling betrayal. It was one of those suffocatingly humid Atlanta afternoons, but inside the Fulton County Probate Court, the air was glacial. It reeked of old paper, floor wax, and the kind of high-stakes desperation that only vast sums of money can ignite. I was 34 years old, and according to Jennifer, the woman who gave birth to me, I was no longer fit to manage my own life, my own bank account, or the precious legacy my grandmother had left behind. Jennifer didn't look like a villain. She looked like a grieving daughter, polished to a high shine in a charcoal blazer that screamed old money and calculated grace. But when she shrieked the word incompetent, it echoed off those high ceilings, vibrating right through the wooden benches. I felt the weight of every eye in that room shift towards me. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even bother looking up to see the pity or the judgment.
No.
Instead, I held on to the composure of a high-level risk assessment expert, which, by the way, I was. I saw that courtroom not as a stage for drama, but as a threat landscape I was actively auditing. In my line of work, we have a saying, the louder the noise, the weaker the signal. And Jennifer? She was generating a colossal amount of noise. She droned on about my past with a practiced tremor in her voice, weaving a narrative of instability, emotional outbursts, and a supposed inability to handle the weight of an estate. She was digging up ghosts from 20 years ago, reaching back to when I was just 14. That was the year my world stopped spinning, the year my father walked out and Jennifer replaced him with a series of expensive distractions and a man named Michael, who looked at our family like an investment property. I remember that 14-year-old girl. She was broken. She was absolutely drowning in the trauma of a divorce that felt more like a demolition. I remember the school counseling sessions, the quiet corners where I tried to hide my tears, and the records that Jennifer had meticulously kept like ammunition in a safe. She wasn't inventing a story today. She was weaponizing the raw scars of a child who had committed the crime of needing her mother. She stripped away all context, the 20 years of healing, and the professional success I had painstakingly built, leaving only the image of a fragile, messed-up teenager. Judge Sterling sat behind the bench, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. She was known for her precision, a woman who had spent decades seeing through the performances of the desperate. She let Jennifer speak for what felt like an eternity. And I knew why. Silence was my fortress. In risk assessment, the one who speaks the most is the one who reveals the most vulnerabilities. Jennifer thought my silence was a sign of surrender, a white flag hoisted in the face of her superior firepower. She had no idea it was actually a perimeter fence. For years, I had lived in a state of hypervigilance, a survival mechanism born from emotional abuse. When you are raised by someone who treats your emotions like a liability, you learn to process the world through data. You stop reacting, and you start recording. My grandmother, Ruth, she was the one who taught me that. She used to say, "People lie, but numbers have no agenda." She was the one who took me in when Jennifer decided I was too much work. Ruth didn't give me platitudes. She gave me a ledger. She taught me how to balance a checkbook before I could even drive. And more importantly, she taught me how to spot an entry that didn't belong. As Jennifer finally sat down, smoothing her blazer with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had just delivered a closing argument, her attorney gave a small, arrogant nod. They thought they had trapped me in my own history. They truly believed the records from a grieving 14-year-old would outweigh the reality of a 34-year-old woman who assessed risk for Fortune 500 companies. Then Judge Sterling leaned forward, her glasses sliding ever so slightly down her nose. She looked straight at Jennifer's attorney and asked the question that made the air vanish from the room. "Counselor, do you truly have no idea who you are suing today?" The attorney blinked, his confident posture faltering for a microsecond. "She's an accountant, Your Honor," he stammered. "She works locally." A ghost of a smile almost touched my lips, but I kept my face utterly clinical. The judge didn't respond immediately. She turned her gaze to me, then back to my mother, whose face was already beginning to lose its carefully maintained color. That flicker of recognition in the judge's eyes? That was the first crack in Jennifer's perfectly constructed wall. She thought this hearing was about taking my grandmother's house and my sanity. She had no idea it was actually an audit of her own soul. And as a professional, I knew exactly what happened to people who failed an audit. The Savannah Mansion was more than just a house. It was a relic of a time when the word family meant something more than a legal battle. It sat at the end of a long, moss-draped driveway, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to whisper our family's secrets. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of wrought iron gates and white columns, a symbol of the cross legacy that Jennifer and Michael were so desperate to claim. But for 2 years, I lived behind those columns. I knew the real story wasn't in the architecture. It was in the air that smelled of lavender cleaner and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock that was running out for my grandmother, Ruth. I wasn't just there to hold her hand as she faded. I was the one auditing the pharmacy bills, managing the nursing schedules, and ensuring the roof didn't collapse under the weight of the humid Georgia air. Jennifer and Michael? They only appeared when the sun was high and the photo opportunities were plentiful. They'd sweep in, smelling of expensive perfume and cocktails, play the role of devoted family for an hour, and then disappear back to Atlanta. They looked at that house and saw equity. I looked at that house and saw a woman who had given me everything when my own mother had treated me like an expired insurance policy. 6 months before she passed, I noticed the first anomaly. I was sitting at her mahogany desk, reviewing the trust account activity, and the numbers just didn't align. My pulse didn't race. It slowed down the way it does when I'm identifying a high-level systemic risk at work. I found a series of irregular withdrawals that bypassed the standard operating procedures of the trust. Michael, a man whose only real contribution to our family was a history of bad bets and gambling debts, had found a vulnerability. He had secretly and illegally withdrawn $96,400 from my grandmother's trust account. He didn't do it all at once. He did it in irregular intervals, thinking that rounded numbers would look like home repairs or medical expenses. But I had been tracking fraud for years. I knew that people who steal once rarely stop. And Michael? He was a man who lived in a state of constant financial oxygen deprivation. He had used that money to pay off offshore gambling sites and the creditors who were starting to circle his own failed business ventures. He had orchestrated a complex web of fraud totaling $1.8 million, but that money was tied up in frozen offshore accounts and failing overseas investments. He was asset-rich on paper, but drowning in immediate debt. He desperately needed that $96,400 in liquid cash to stop a private creditor from seizing his cars and office. And he thought my grandmother's trust was an easy, untraceable ATM. It was a sloppy, panicked move. The kind of mistake a seasoned thief makes when his back is against the wall. The theft was clinical, but the consequence was immediate. Because Michael had gutted the trust to keep his own head above water, the account was completely depleted. So when the annual property tax bill for the Savannah Mansion arrived, there was nothing left. These weren't just warnings, they were final notices. Michael had been siphoning the tax escrow for 3 consecutive years, hiding the mail while the interest compounded. The house that had been in our family for generations was on the verge of foreclosure. I didn't call Jennifer to scream. Instead, I treated my mother and stepfather as a bad debt that I was forced to restructure. I opened my personal savings account and transferred exactly $96,400 of my own hard-earned money into the estate account to pay the taxes. I saved the house, but I didn't do it for them. Jennifer and Michael thought they were the predators, and I was just the quiet girl paying the bills. They didn't realize that by using my own money to cover their theft, I had officially bought the right to their downfall. Jennifer understood the world of corporate optics with terrifying precision. She didn't need to win the court case to destroy me immediately. She just needed to create enough radioactive doubt to freeze my professional momentum. The anonymous letter she sent to the Fortune 500 corporation where I worked merely expressed grave concern for my well-being, citing my supposed mental instability as a systemic threat to the firm. But Jennifer didn't stop at words. She attached a notarized copy of the pending guardianship petition, making it look like I was a legal liability to the firm's multi-billion-dollar accounts. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, liability is a radioactive word. The conference room at the office was freezing. My supervisor, a woman I had respected for 5 years, wouldn't even look me in the eye. She spoke in the hollow language of human resources. I sat there, watching my entire professional life being dismantled. I wasn't being fired. I was being sidelined. No new contracts, no access to the secure servers, and no expert testimony. 7 years of establishing a fortress of credibility was erased with a single filing of a mother's malicious lie. Liam, my new boyfriend, was the next pillar to crumble. He sat across from me at our kitchen table, his face a mask of misplaced, weary sympathy. But Jennifer had spent weeks poisoning his mind, feeding his own career insecurities with lies about my mental decline and the impending scandal. He didn't just leave because he was scared. He left because Jennifer offered him a way out of a messy relationship he was too weak to handle. "Emily, maybe she does have a point about the stress," he whispered, avoiding my gaze. "Taking a psychological evaluation doesn't mean you're crazy. It just proves her wrong." He didn't understand that for people like Jennifer, there is no closing the book. He was gaslighting me under the guise of being the reasonable one, pressuring me to compromise my truth so his own life could be comfortable again. I didn't cry or scream. I simply realized that our relationship was just another liability I needed to offload. Jennifer was busy conquering social media. She had mastered the art of the digital weep, posting photos of the Savannah mansion at sunset. Her status updates were long, tear-stained narratives about the tragedy of a daughter lost to madness. She was harvesting pity, turning her greed into a public service announcement for mental health awareness. The comments flooded in, prayers for the saintly mother and condemnation for the ungrateful, unstable daughter. But being sidelined by my firm wasn't a punishment. Oh no, it was an invitation to go hunting. While Jennifer was busy playing the martyr, I was back in my element. Jennifer thought she had won, but she had actually given me the one thing a forensic investigator needs most: time. I didn't waste a second on anger. Instead, I performed a deep tissue audit of every single document Jennifer had filed to seize my grandmother's legacy. I started with the power of attorney. It was the master key she had used to unlock my grandmother's trust. On the surface, the document looked pristine. But I looked at the notary's commission number. I recognized the name of the notary from an old regional fraud database. I spent 4 grueling hours digging through public health records and obituary archives until I found it. The notary, whose stamp appeared on Jennifer's power of attorney, had been deceased for 3 years. Jennifer hadn't just manipulated my grandmother. She had used a dead man's identity to manufacture legal authority. This was a felony. I knew that in the architecture of greed, one lie is usually a support beam for a much larger structure. So, I started looking into the premium payments in the 2 months leading up to my grandmother's death. Jennifer had insisted her mother passed peacefully. Yet, I found a secret expenditure. Tucked behind a series of rerouted transfers was a premium payment for a high-value life insurance policy. She had exploited a telehealth loophole, forging my grandmother's digital signature on a medical waiver that claimed the old woman was in perfect health. It was a calculated felony. A high-stakes bet on a woman who couldn't even hold a pen anymore. Jennifer had secretly taken out a policy on my grandmother just 8 weeks before she died. The payout was staggering. Jennifer had been positioning herself for a blood money windfall. Jennifer and Michael weren't just thieves. They were predators who had been counting down the days of a dying woman's life like it was a ticker tape. I didn't call the police. No. I simply added the insurance documents and the undeniable evidence of the forged notary stamp to a secure folder labeled Dead Man's Switch. They weren't there by chance. I had spent the last 48 hours feeding encrypted spreadsheets to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, linking Michael's small-time theft to a much larger offshore money laundering scheme. The silence in the courtroom was finally broken by Judge Sterling. She looked directly at Jennifer's attorney. "Counselor," she said, her voice like a sharpening stone, "before we go any further, I have one question for you. Do you truly have no idea who you are suing today?" Arthur Nolan straightened his silk tie, his confidence momentarily back. "She is an accountant, Your Honor," he replied. Judge Sterling didn't blink. "No, Counselor," she said evenly. "Emily is a senior strategic consultant for global insurance conglomerates. In fact, this very court has contracted her firm on multiple occasions to audit seven-figure estate fraud cases. She is the person we call when people like your client try to hide their tracks." The air vanished from the room. Jennifer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The mother, who had spent months calling me crazy, was now staring at the person who audited predators for a living. I stood up. My movement was clinical, precise. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady. While my mother was busy building a theatrical production of my madness, I was busy performing an audit. I have submitted a file to the clerk. I call it the dead man switch. The documents I had meticulously gathered were projected for everyone to see. Inside this file, you'll find the encrypted paper trail for $1.8 million in systemic fraud and embezzlement orchestrated by Michael across 3 different state lines. I paused, letting that sink in. The $96,400 he stole from my grandmother's trust was just the beginning. Then I clicked to the next slide. And here is the secretly filed life insurance policy Jennifer took out on her own mother only 8 weeks before she passed away. Jennifer let out a strangled, guttural sound. This wasn't an inheritance dispute. This was a crime scene. And I had already performed the autopsy. The power flip was absolute. Jennifer's face went from pale to a ghastly gray. Her carefully constructed high society lady persona dissolved into the stark, terrified look of a trapped con artist. There was no more noise, no more shrieking about my mental health. There were only the numbers. Judge Sterling didn't even need to use her gavel. She simply looked at the court clerk and then at the 2 federal agents who had been waiting quietly at the back of the room. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Sterling began, her voice unwavering. "This court finds the petition for guardianship not only unfounded, but malicious. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. The evidence of financial exploitation, forgery, and systematic fraud will be referred immediately to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution. Counselor, your client is no longer the petitioner. She is a person of interest in a multi-state felony investigation." Michael was taken into custody right there in the front row. Jennifer sat frozen. She had spent her life performing the role of a high society lady whose status was built entirely on a foundation of borrowed money and my grandmother's goodness. Now she was experiencing the brutal reality of what happens when the credit runs out. My mother's power was an illusion, a thick layer of expensive makeup that had finally been washed away by the cold, unforgiving water of the truth. She had mistaken my silence for a blank check and my endurance for an infinite line of credit. Jennifer was eventually sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for forgery and fraud. Michael received 10 years for his role in the embezzlement and gambling schemes that had crossed state lines. The life insurance policy was voided, and the $1.8 million Michael had moved through the trust was frozen for restitution. I didn't stay to watch them be taken away. Instead, I returned to Savannah. I sold the mansion and used the $96,400 I had reclaimed, plus the rest of the estate, to establish a legal defense fund for the elderly. I named it the Ruth Cross Foundation, a place dedicated to protecting seniors from the very kind of financial exploitation that had targeted my grandmother. I've come to realize that some people spend their whole lives trying to win through sheer volume. They think that if they scream the loudest or tell the most convincing lie, they can rewrite reality. They are wrong. Justice doesn't need a microphone. It just needs a ledger. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you are the one standing alone against a family that tries to make you feel invisible, remember this. Your silence is not your weakness. It is your perspective. It is the quiet room where you gather your facts, where you check your numbers, and where you wait for the people who think they are winning to make their inevitable mistake. To those of you who have always felt like you were on the edge, the ones who are called different or difficult because you saw things others wanted to hide, stay patient. The truth has its own rhythm. It doesn't need to be defended. It just needs the space to be seen. You are not alone, and you are far more powerful than the noise they make. Have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to define your reality for their own gain? What did you do? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.